Well, hey, everybody. We want to welcome you back to another episode of On the Other Hand. I'm your host, Jonathan. This is the other host, Jonathan. We're the Jonathans.
That's true.
And we're hosting, and we decided last minute to dress identical for this episode.
So it wasn't actually a decision.
We should have called each other ahead of time to say no to this.
Yeah, it's
but
like
we didn't.
Beanie Brothers or something.
We're going with.
Here we are.
Yeah,
you're stuck with it.
Yeah, and this is a podcast that where we talk about issues that everybody's thinking about, difficult issues, and there's often two sides to these issues, and we talk about those things you're thinking about, and we try to resolve them with some decent thinking from a biblical perspective.
That's our hope.
That's our hope.
Yes, the decent thinking part and the biblical perspective.
That's right. And we're glad that you're joining us. So we want to get right down to it. We actually titled this one Felony Flats. And there's a story behind it. And I'll kind of use this story to get us into the framework of the discussion for this episode. When my wife, Shannon, and I were moving into a neighborhood, buying our very first home as a youth pastor, we moved into a town of Salem, Oregon, so this can all be verified, checked out, and we moved into a neighborhood that had been right next to a factory that had been there for years and years and years, a mushroom plant, and as a result... A mushroom plant. That's right. They were making mushrooms, pumping them out like crazy, man. And so the whole place, it was filled with duplexes and different things. When that plant left, a lot of the workers, a lot of the money left, and so it had taken on the name Felony Flats. And we thought it was just a godsend for us to be able to live there because we could afford the house. But we also discovered that it was
a steal of a deal.
It was a steal of a deal.
Yeah.
We also discovered it was a place where there's high crime. There was a lot of gang activity. Our house got graffitied, once or twice. I'd come home from youth ministry and there'd be a bomb sniffing dog. This happened multiple times, outside of our door or in our neighborhood. And security cams and everything. In fact, one of the funny things is we had like one of these dogs that was like a golden retriever dog, But
your dog, not the bomb.
Our dog.
Okay.
But it was the only dog in the entire neighborhood like that. There were other kinds of dogs for protecting property. And so it was called by all the locals, everybody understood this was Felony Flats. And so here's where I want to go with that. It was interesting. It was a great place to live and to do ministry. A lot of the people that were attending our church lived in this neighborhood, and we all felt good about it, developed friendships and relationships in that neighborhood. But there was a moment as we just kind of reflected on the situation and how we were living, where we had children. We had 2 children, and we started realizing that they were going to be going to school in this neighborhood, that their friends would be in this neighborhood. And we knew that not every relationship was safe and sound. And we had to ask that question, is there a point at which good ministry conflicts with good family? Is there a moment where we have permission to walk away from this ministry in an effort to have good boundaries for our family? I just feel like that's a tension that many of us face. And so we want to kind of put that into a phrase, or really a question. Is it ever right for Christians to move themselves and their families or their families into harm's way? And maybe we need to define what harm looks like, but this is a question, is it ever right for Christians to move themselves and their families into harm's way? Do we have permission to do that? Or, on the other hand, do we have permission to move out of a situation where we think the boundaries may be a little bit flawed?
Yeah. Well, and to your point, it is important, I think, to define what we mean when we say harm's way, right?
Yeah.
Because people that you and I both work with, missionaries that we support, they would not define that community as in harm's way, right? Yeah. They'd say first world problems, right? And so what do we mean when we say harm's way? I think is an important distinction to make, because before we can actually discern, are we actually at risk?
Yeah.
What level of risk is there everywhere that we go? right? And so I think we're really asking the question, what is an acceptable level of risk? I wouldn't put my child in front of an active shooter, right? But I might take them into a place where the risk is much higher for them. And do I have permission to do that? And do I have permission to not do that?
Yeah, and I mean, am I concocting just an arbitrary sort of a story here, or is this something that's real that you think people are really wrestling with?
I think the answer to that is yes, and I'll frame it this way, because I have multiple friends who felt like God has called them to the mission field, even specific locations, and to this day, they have continued to come up with excuses as to why they cannot go yet. And we're talking in some of these situations 20 years. And most of those things have to do with some perception of doing harm to my family or my children, or I want them to be able to finish high school here and it'll mess with them emotionally or psychologically, or we don't have enough money yet and so they'll be going without.
Are you talking about me now? Because this is hitting a little bit close to home, man.
Is it? That's right. I actually wasn't. Yeah. But on the other hand.
Well, it is. Those are questions I've literally asked myself.
So I think in that sense, for people who love Jesus, when they hear the stories that appear to us as stories of great faith, we're asking the question, okay, God, should I be doing that?
Yeah.
And you can feel guilty if you don't, and you could also make excuses for not. So I think it goes both directions.
That's good.
I think often we do make unnecessary excuses, but that issue of permission, I think, is a really interesting concept, because what we're really talking about is, how do I discern the will of God? Because there are situations in which God has given very clear directives, and now for me to not do it would be disobedience.
Yeah. So you and I discussed this outside of this context, right? But the idea of permission versus obedience, that at some point in answering any of these kinds of questions, we may be free to do one thing, but if the Lord speaks, now it's a matter of obedience. And so we're going to look at that, and I think to answer the other question, is this a pertinent tension or an issue people are facing? You mentioned missionaries or people that right now. I know I just read a few days ago an article in the news about the fact that they're in Afghanistan, the situation there, that there are many organizations, some I'm not even aware of, I'm sure, that where Christians are running to, if you will, harm's way, as opposed to running away from it. And in some cases, maybe taking their families with them. It's literally the same thing we're talking about. And it's one of those things where I think people are wrestling with that. Is it wise? Is it difficult? That's not really the question. We know it's difficult. The question we're asking is it right? Is that acceptable? What does God think about that? If you're a Christian and you're listening to that, that's the question you have. What does God think about this? Because we want to please God.
Yeah. Is it inherently evil to take my family out of harm's way, or even to take myself out of harm's way, right? And I think growing up in the church and hearing missionaries come, I grew up with this belief that whatever it is that you don't want to do, that must be the thing the Lord wants you to do, right? And so the missionary from Africa shows up and he says, I told the Lord, the one thing I don't want you to make me do is go to Africa. And what do you think you made me do? And there's sort of almost this martyr complex where whatever the most difficult thing is, the thing I least like to do, that must be what the Lord wants me to do. Now, it may be what he wants you to do, but it isn't by default the thing that he wants you to do, right? That I actually could do something else without him speaking some other direction clearly, and he would bless that.
Yeah, good.
And I'll just say this, for me personally, actually the decision to come back to the Valley and take the position that I'm in now at the church was the first time in my life that I can remember where the Lord actually, in my heart and in my mind, but with clarity, spoke to me that he would bless either decision, to stay put where I was or to pack up and come here, which for me, the way I'm wired, was extremely frustrating, because I'd prefer for him just to tell me to do this, because my reflex would be, yes, I'm not risk adverse. And so if the Lord would just say, do this, Jonathan, but like really precisely, really clearly, he said to me, Jonathan, I will bless either decision. I'm inviting you to join me in what I want to do in the valley. That was much more difficult for me than having a clear sense of a direction or a directive from the Lord. And yet I think there are those moments where he says, either one of these I can bless. You decide.
So, and that articulates, this is a difficult issue. This is something that requires prayer, requires time. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of talk on both sides of this. We're going to talk about reasons to leave what we perceive as a harmful situation to ourselves or our family. And then we're going to talk from the other side of that perspective. Are there good reasons to move into these places, even with our families? And then kind of talk a little bit about some of the biblical things that guard our hearts or lead us as we try to make some of these difficult decisions. So let's start out with that first side of things. When it comes to, if we were to just kind of try to dig out of the scriptures, Jonathan, some of the things that might argue for permission to leave a situation, going back to my illustration of there we are, and we're wondering, is this the place I want to raise my children? Is that a legitimate question to even ask, right? Where would you go?
So for me to just build a biblical framework around it, because what I don't think we have permission to do is to just go live whatever life we want to live.
That's good, yeah.
Right? Whatever I want to do, God just loves me being happy, right? Actually, the scriptures very clearly call us to lay our lives down. You're not your own. You were bought with a price, right? That if anyone wants to be my disciple, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And so there's this element of my life doesn't belong to me. But that's different than can I do things I enjoy, right? Does the Lord give me permission? And so for me, when I look at a situation that is potentially dangerous, there are a couple of passages that come to mind. One is in the Old Testament where he says a righteous man is called to defending those who cannot defend themselves. Even the description of who Job was in his community. He was the one who broke the teeth of the oppressor. The widow rejoiced when she saw him coming. The children leapt when they saw him approach. Right? That he was a defender of the defenseless. And the other is that he who doesn't provide for his own family is worse than an infidel. Right? That I have this mandate and responsibility to my children and my family to protect and provide. And so if I'm in a situation where I cannot do those things and I have a choice to get out of it, I could go to the scriptures and build a legitimate case as to why the Lord's will for me would be to provide for my family and protect my family.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to discern that because they're my family. Everything else I'm trying to discern the Lord's will in, but this is a responsibility He has clearly given to me. And so I can make a case for, I need to protect my family and I need to provide for my family. Now, the question then is, what does protect and provide mean? Because it doesn't mean provide a college education for them. Although in America we'd probably say, oh no, you have to provide a car, you have to provide a college education.
No, it's good. It's good you bring that up because my mind is thinking about that goes to the words of James, Jesus' brother, and one of the things he says is there's an arrogance in pretending to know outcomes. What is going to happen tomorrow? And that's directly related to today's decisions. So I make this decision to protect my family, and and then it comes with this assumption that I know what is best, that I know what is safest, that I know what is most secure. In that context, it was about financial security or business relationships or whatever. But the reality is that the Bible's fairly specific. We don't know what is best or what is most secure, or the day of our death, right? Those are parables Jesus tells, those kinds of things, and that there does seem to be this this desire that we labor with the Lord, and the Lord is not always in secure, safe spaces here in this world, right?
Yeah, even for our own children. I mean, when you think about the words of people like Mother Teresa and others, if you want to be close to Jesus, be close to the destitute and dying, right? That there's something my kids are going to glean. If my ultimate goal is that they would draw close to Jesus, then the safest place physically might not be the best place for them, right? And to your point, I think that starts to drive at the heart of our decision making. If I can discern if I'm making this decision out of fear or out of faith,
right,
that begins to help bring some clarity. God, search my heart. Tell me, right? Am I making this decision out of fear? Because whatever is not of faith is sin. And so I need to deal with the fear piece, because the truth is exactly like you said. I don't know. I could put my kids and my wife on a plane, and that plane could crash.
That's right.
And the Lord knew that, and he was telling us to stay put because he was going to protect us like Daniel in the lion's den, right? We don't know all of those things, and that's why we need the presence and the power of the Holy Spirit to speak to those, because I don't know if there's always a right or wrong answer to them.
Yeah, and to that point, we look historically at how the church has functioned. At more recent times, if you were to look at the missions movement, answering that question, what do we know? There was the assumption early on, what we call the modern missions movement, Hudson Taylor's where they went out as solo, right? Amy Carmichael, it was a solo venture.
Not because they didn't have families.
Nope. The family supported them from them. That was seen as wise or safe or secure, the right way to do it. And then later on, maybe I can take a spouse with me. And then later on, well, if I take a spouse with me and it's in harm's way, and we have children, we'll put them into a missionary, MK school is what they're called, right? Because that's the right thing to do. That's the wise thing to do. And then you have all the way to the other spectrum now, where it's like, no, we're taking it's full on, cultural integration. We're going to be a family with other families who are living in, embedded in that community. So you see that sort of evolution in how we've addressed this issue in the past, and we're all wrestling with that.
Well, and if our priority, I think for many of us, our priorities are children, right? And so when you look at, I have a missionary friend, grew up on the mission field. They were poor as dirt, right? They couldn't afford peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Mm-hmm. Dad gets skin cancer on the mission field, dies from skin cancer. And you would think that would be a traumatic experience for the children, and yet they are so filled with faith and gratitude for the life that God gave them. Yeah. And yet kids with everything you could want in the Western world are miserable and depressed. And we have a mutual friend who's one of our missionaries. I get to spend time routinely with his children, and they have been in some of the most dangerous places in the world, and yet they are more alive, enjoy life more. They're in college back here in the U.S. right now, and as soon as they're done, they're heading back to join mom and dad on the front lines in some of the most dangerous places in the world. And so we make certain assumptions about what our kids do and don't need, and what the Lord knows is exactly what they need. And I think we make assumptions that are very Western in their frame. Yeah,
we get the opportunity to create white picket fence situations where that's just simply even not an option in most communities worldwide, and it perhaps it even creates more of a tension than needs to exist there. On the other hand, we look into the scriptures to Jerusalem, first century. Day of Pentecost, the church is born, and there was a very specific mission given to the church. You're going to go from Jerusalem to Judea, to Samaria, to the remotest parts of the earth. And then what we find out later on is that actually wasn't happening. For 10 years, the majority church stayed put in Jerusalem because it was a minor persecution, relatively good experience. It was where Peter was, James was. It was where things were happening. It was where decisions were being made. That's right.
All the right worship and the best speakers and the miracles.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then we see the Spirit of God actually, I believe, bring in another level of persecution. We see the stoning of Stephen. We encounter Saul for the first time, and it's through that mechanism that people disperse. They actually feel like they can leave. And what happens is, and history records it, is they go global. They go to Rome, they go to Turkey, they go to India, they go all over the place, and they spread the gospel and actually begin to fulfill the thing that Jesus wanted his church to do. So it seems obvious to me that there are those situations where we're given permission. It can even be part of God's will to actually take us to places that are better than the place we were in. Mm-hmm. For all kinds of reasons, and maybe we don't know all the reasons, but there seems to be an illustration of it's okay to flee persecution as a matter of self-defense even.
Yeah, absolutely.
Paul, being lowered down outside of a wall to defend himself. He could have stayed there and taken it on the cheek.
Jesus cloaking himself.
That's right.
And walking straight through the crowd that wanted to kill him prematurely. He wasn't afraid of death, but it was a mission that he had, an assignment that he had, and the right thing to do in that moment was to flee the risk or the danger that he was in. And that's where I think those seasons can come and go for us in life. And the reality is, for my son, going with us to India and to one of the most heavily persecuted places at the time, Orissa. We had to go in at night. Caleb was, I believe, 14 years old at the time, maybe a little bit younger. And what that experience communicated to him was a couple of things. One, we're not risk averse. If there are people who need to hear the gospel, we're going to go to them. And two, God is our protector. He's our defender. And the reality is that if we experienced martyrdom in that moment, that is clearly not the worst thing that could have happened to us. We think of it in those terms. Look at everything they missed out on because their life ended prematurely. And yet from a biblical Christian perspective, in that moment, there is nothing but rejoicing for them.
Yeah.
Right? And reframes it.
Absolutely. And that brings up the idea of wisdom, right? When it comes to these situations, Paul practices wisdom. Jesus practices wisdom. Maybe talk about that a little bit when it comes to taking our family into what we would describe as harm's way for the gospel for all the right reasons. This isn't a pursuit of without thought, without process, without wisdom. We're not divorcing that from wisdom from a spiritual endeavor.
Yeah, that's what was so interesting to me about the language of do we put our family in harm's way?
Yeah.
I don't think we ever put our family in a situation in which death is guaranteed, right? And so I actually have two friends right now who are in Afghanistan. One was already there and chose to stay when they had an exit, right? They and their family, they're not nationals, they're from outside of Afghanistan, but they have clearly felt like they heard from the Lord that they are to remain and aid. The other was here in the U.S. and is now en route to Afghanistan. Now, people would look at that and say, well, why would you go into harm's way? They are not intentionally going to their death, right? What they're doing is they're saying, I think this risk is manageable. And so in the scenario with my son and going into Orissa, we went in at night. We went in with a national, right? I mean, we took certain precautions because we're not going in to die. We're going in to preach the gospel. We're going in to declare life, and we want to continue to do that in as many places as we can. You manage the risk. I don't think we're ever called to just lead our children, lead our spouse into death.
And what you're describing is what many people have called a martyr mentality, or sort of this idea that kind of an exaltation of martyrdom.
Yeah.
Kind of elevating it above all else, and we're not actually saying that's the correct model.
No, to your point, we tend to listen to stories of heroism, right? And we say, whoever is in the most danger is the most spiritual.
Right.
That simply isn't true, right? It's honorable, but it's no more honorable than going to work today and making money for my family so that my family's provided for and I preach the gospel in my house.
So, in fact, I actually want to. There's a verse out of Acts that speaks directly to this issue of, who is the most spiritual, right? And it's interesting to me. It's out of Acts chapter 16. I'll just read it here for our audience. Picking up in verse 6, this is the Apostle Paul, his companions, and they're on a missions journey. This is what they're doing. Yeah. And every option that is presented here is a difficult option, is an option that will lead them into harm's way, right? And listen to how they make their decision. I think it's profound. They passed through the Phrygian and Galatian region, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia. It's like, I thought we were supposed to speak the word no matter what, and all over the world. And yet here we have a limiting of that in some sense. But it continues. And after they came to Mysia, they were trying to go into Bithynia. and the Spirit of Jesus did not permit them. I would love to know what that means, like physically, or did a sign, or some carving in a stone,
with a sword.
But whatever the case may be, they knew they were not permitted to go, and they had all the right motives.
Yeah.
And they were not risk averse, and they knew the cost. They'd counted the cost, and yet here there's a no answer from heaven. And passing by Mysia, they came to Troas. A vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing and appealing to him and saying, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And this is the verdict. When he had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. Mm-hmm. And you see this sort of, hey, we're not risk averse. Right. But we're not just going wherever, shotgun style. Right. We are not interested in just preaching. We're interested in preaching specifically where God wants us to speak, and that's the model that we get from the New Testament.
That sensitivity, right? Walking in step with the Spirit. And we got about 2 minutes here, maybe less now. But one of my friends who's headed into Afghanistan right now, I was on the phone with him a couple of weeks ago, and he said, my prayer over this whole journey has been, and this is no exaggeration, he literally has an invitation from the current president of Afghanistan, who was the vice president before the president fled. And so he's got this invitation, and he says this to me. He says, and my prayer is, God, if you don't want us there, close the door. And he says, but I have this concern that maybe I pried the door open with my pinky, and it immediately comes to me, right, that the Lord is so clear. He says, the doors that the Lord shuts, no man can open. And the doors that he opens, no man can shut. Which tells me that your pinky can't push the door open that the Lord is refusing. If your heart is in the right place, right, if you want to hear from him, that's, I think, the simplest prayer. Right, if we can identify our motivations, if we're motivated by fear, then I need to reevaluate my decision. But once I can identify those things and lay those before the Lord, what I really want is for him to give me direction. Close the door or open the door. I want to keep moving, but that's what I hear in that passage in Acts is they're listening, they're sensitive. And so when these doors are closed, their assumption is there's got to be one somewhere. Let's try this. Nope, that one's closed. Let's try nope, that one's closed. And then the Lord comes in a vision, and they get the invitation, they say yes.
Man,
it's obedience.
So good. It's obedience. God calls us to these places. And we just really hope that encourages you and gives you some framework, some way to think through some of those issues, tensions, again, that we all face, we're all wrestling through. And if you found this to be a valuable resource for you today, we'd ask you to share it with a friend, subscribe to our channel. We'd love for you to do that. That'd be wonderful. Like it. You know the rest.
Pitch some topics our way.
Absolutely. Email us. We'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, I think that's it for today. And we hope that God blesses you. And we want you to know we're praying for you. We'll see you next week.